Hi, and welcome back to Unmasking the Trans Movement with John Mueller. I'm Brad Wilder, your host. Today on the show, Tracy Shannon is here. She's a trans widow. And we're going to discuss the Equality Act. Down in the U.S., they've got an Equality Act that's about to be implemented called H.R. 15. And it sounds like it's getting pretty big support, not only by, obviously, the liberal side, but also the GOP side. And that means that this goes into effect. How is this going to, well, affect things going forward? Let's bring in the experts. John, great to have you back on the show. Tracy as well. Welcome back.
Brad, thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and Tracy, thank you for joining us. And you have come with information that we all need. This is hot off the press, so to speak, because a lot of people do not know that this is making its way through, at least in the U.S., the U.S. Congress. So talk to us. There's what's called H.R. 15. For those that don't know what H.R. means, it's House Resolution 15. Means that within the U.S. House of Representatives, somebody has introduced a bill. So talk to us about the Equality Act and the dangers that this poses to every good and sane individual in the U.S.
Well, we're in very big trouble because this bill is likely to pass, and the dishonest media is portraying it as protection for minorities, which is important in a country like ours. But it's actually an attack on the rights of the majority of citizens, and it will criminalize anyone who publicly challenges LGBTQ rights, which even the LGBTQ nation, when they talked about it, described it as enshrining privileges into law. So let me see if I can find what they said. Here's what they said. LGBTQ nation wrote, the Q in LGBTQ, which is in the bill, can also signify other sexual orientations and genders not covered by the acronym's preceding letters. If you're gender neutral, non-binary, agender, gender fluid, pansexual, asexual, solosexual, or something else not covered by LGBT, the Q has got you covered. That's what they said. And so then it says this extensive legislation will elevate privileges for LGBTQ conduct. Okay, this is not their commentary. So what they're not saying, so it's going to, these are actually privileges, and Q's got you covered. Well, that can include 550 sexually deviant paraphilias. So, John, you know more of those than I do, and I would assume that includes pedophilia. And we had this problem.
That's right, Tracy. When you're referencing, 90s. When you're referencing the Q, so this is LGBTQ+++. So the Q actually stands for queer, but as you are now describing it, that's going to be an umbrella category for all sorts of things, including those that want to decriminalize pedophilia, which can be done by an end run. If you grant a pedophile civil rights protected status, then he's not going to be prosecuted.
Right. And let's just run through the ways in which this bill, which is supported by 212 House Democrats already that have co-sponsored it, it will force churches and every person to accept and promote radical perversions encompassed by the Q. And they'll be federally protected if this Equality Act passes. So what that means is the threat to parental rights. So when a parent does not come into agreement with their child's transition, then their rights will be at risk. And what about the churches who preach against transition and other things encompassed by LGBTQ? Their free speech is at risk, and all Christians' free speech is at risk. This is at odds with all that is American when it comes to having First Amendment rights. So this is a terrible bill, and it is a threat to all of us, because what we know from watching the trajectory of the transgender movement in other countries as it's progressed, such as Australia, is the transgender movement is it cannot coexist with other rights. So it's just rolling over other people's rights, such as the rights of women to their own private spaces, like locker rooms, bathrooms, women's dormitories, women's prisons, women's shelters, and even women's sorority and business networks that are to elevate women in industries where they're not where they are a minority, and those are at risk because men are men are even identifying into beauty pageants for women and winning now. So nobody's sacred space or their rights is even safe with the gender ideology being enshrined into law and into our culture. So we really need to raise the alarms about this and get our phone calls into your House members in DC. And I call your senator too, because I'm sure it will go to the Senate after it's out of the House. But this is just reintroduced. We're not hearing a lot of it about it in the media. We've got to make sure that this does not pass, and that if you're a Democrat, and you support women's rights, you should not be supporting this Equality Act, because it is going to erase all the progress that has been made for women in this country. If you're a Christian and on the left or the right, you should not be supporting this. You need to call your Congress critter and let them know you can't be behind this. It may sound good on the surface, but this is a bad bill that will hurt all Americans because it privileges a few.
And you just referenced certain groups that need to be awakened. All women need to understand that, this is the existential threat, right? That every person, regardless of which side of the political aisle they fall on, and therefore shame on the Democrats, that this is the ultimate silencing of women. Talking about the silence of the lambs. People need to understand that really what this boils down to is deviant men, porn-saturated men who have entered the realm of sexual psychopathy find it a plausible option to dress in women's underwear and drag in order then to demand access into every single thing that has to do with women, the most private of areas, and children. And this is the ultimate way sexually deviant men can silence and eradicate women. So all it takes is for a guy, and I do sex offender treatment, have for 15 years now, and I'm here to tell people that sexually deviant men who've gone far enough have no problem, because they've developed a deep malevolence toward women because of the porn they've been accessing, just as these kind of men have no problem grabbing the throat of a woman. This is the ultimate grabbing the throat of a woman and silencing her by now, through federal legislation, ensuring that no one can say anything, whether on social media, in churches. Pastors, clergy had better realize that if this thing passes, they're in a world of hurt, because there are going to be not only possible civil penalties, but just as in Australia, there are going to be criminal penalties. It's happening now in Canada to parents. Brad, there's a case up in Canada right now where a dad refused to acknowledge the gender, this change in gender. The daughter comes home, she says she's a boy. He refuses to acknowledge that. Somebody was grooming the kid at school, and he is now, he's spent time in prison. I don't know if he's still there, but Brad, speak from a Canadian perspective. You all are living this out. Help awaken the American audience to what they're looking at if this thing goes through.
Well, it's basically going to change everything for you Americans in that regard, just like it's trying to be changed here in Canada. I think that this is happening from a WEF perspective, the World Economic Forum. I believe that there's bigger powers at play. Some of this becomes distraction, some of it becomes psyop. There's just so many other terms that are dealing with this particular subject. Canadians are faced with everything right now, much like Australians and people in New Zealand. We're seeing it in France and Germany. I think the pressure was on with Sri Lanka at one point, and they've since ran those political leaders out of their own country, taken over the palace again, creating a new country there and reforming themselves as best they can. This is all about breakdown of society. It's all about depopulation. There's just so many things that come into play when we talk about this. And so Canadians are being bombarded by inflation and gas prices and, food prices. And how are we going to maintain our mortgage with interest rates going up? Are they bankrupting the countries? I believe that they are. I mean, we're printing money out of thin air, and there's no accountability for that money that's being printed. So politically, there's just so much coming at us when you talk about the trans movement. It's just a tiny little speck in the movement of this. And yet the real drive here in Canada is engaging this trans movement to our kids, like indoctrinating our kids into this ideology. And, I think that we're faced with laws now that are starting to push us in a place like you guys are being pushed in America, which again takes you down a path that is not going to be beneficial for the safety and the security of your own children going forward. Their lives are going to be affected with this forever, just based on the money that's being printed alone, let alone the other damage that's happening to the core family values that they're disrupting, sending kids home with this ideology, busting up family core. Wow, devastating for us here in Canada. And I think Americans, I don't mean to cut down Canadians, but I think you guys have a little bit more edge. You have a little bit more oomph, a little more power, a little more Texan, a little more, Floridian. Those are just a couple of the states who are being proactive in your area that, are standing up to what's going on in California, for example. Here in Canada, that pushback hasn't happened yet. We follow you guys a lot up here. So when we see, HR 15 come out in the States, yeah, we're probably thinking that, they're a little late to the table. That's already happened here. But at the same time, your pushback has not trickled over here. It's just starting to. What's Bill HR 15 going to do for you guys? Where do you see that headed for America? And that's really what's going to dictate to what happens here. I mean, that's the reality of it. We follow you guys.
Well, it's going to really hurt women who are in domestic violence situations with these kind of men, because these men will have the added protections. And, if there's a domestic dispute in the home, which most often happens with the men, not the women, and the men definitely have the advantage in a physical situation, yet they're going to be seen as the victims once this passes into law. That's already, and not only that, the women will be accused of a hate crime, and God forbid anybody would mislaunch a pronoun at work or in service to the community, or they may face civil fines or criminal penalties. That's the direction this is going. Your parental rights, of course, are at odds. Your right to adopt is also at risk, and to foster children also. We already see that this ideology at work in those institutions, every institution really in the United States. This will just enshrine it into law and make it very hard to get around how captured all these institutions are right now. So we have to really work to stop this.
I mean, the men are the ones doing the transitioning more so than the females, based on the numbers and the statistics. Yet we keep addressing, the whole movement, but reality is it's the men who are the real problem here, isn't it, John?
Brad, you bring up the crucial point. What's so unique about this movement is, if we're just focused on gender confusion, historically it's been boys that will wrestle with this kind of confusion. So historically, we saw boys, not many of them. As a matter of fact, most clinicians would never encounter a single situation in their entire career. I've been doing this for 30 years, worked with extremely troubled teens, never encountered one. Encountered sexual confusion, of course, but never one trans prior to the year 2005. And even then, it's very, very rare until this tidal wave, the tsunami. In this, when we're talking about the trans deception, the trans movement, we're primarily talking about girls transitioning to boys, so female to male. But when it comes to the political muscle, this is all the deviant men that are dressing in women's underwear and drag that are forcing themselves into the private spaces of women and children. You don't hear of any women demanding the right to go into the men's room. They're right. When you see these deviants that are taking pictures of themselves in the opposite gendered bathroom, it's the men that are cross-dressing that take pictures of themselves and post it online as trophies, that they crossed all these boundaries. I've never seen one picture of a woman, so female to male, take a picture of herself in the men's room. It doesn't happen. And so in practicality, it's girls that are being targeted for these surgeries because that's where the money is, and sexual predators then have an easier time crossing their boundaries. But in terms of political muscle and what's happening in the Equality Act is it is targeting women for eradication, to silence them and to make them increasingly vulnerable. That's what people need to understand. These are deviant men. And my greatest concern is that within the queue, as Tracy was mentioning, that this hides all sorts of deviance. And the greatest concern, and we're seeing it play out in California, that very deviant individuals are trying to ensure that pedophilia will be protected. This is an end run on age of consent laws. So you have the idea of bodily autonomy introduced, and it's happened in California right now. If you have a high school student or a junior high boy down to the age of 14 to 15 who is targeted by a 24-year-old, think about the age span that is. So, and the most degenerate of all age spans within the deviant lifestyle is within the 20 to 30 range. So right there, right in the middle of that deviance, that hypersexuality, but it's deviance. So you have a 24-year-old that targets a 15-year-old. That's a kid that's just either gotten out of 8th grade or into high school. That man, that deviant, if he's busted, doesn't have to automatically go on the sex offender registry, and he can plead things down. I have 5 guys within my 4 sex offender treatment units or treatment groups that on paper they have no sex offense because they pled things down to assault and battery. That's the danger of this, that you will have guys that will be able to not only change their name if they're sex offenders, so you can't trace them, but you can't stop them from going into the private spaces of women and girls, exactly what Tracy said. And so you have women right now that are suffering in prison, especially in California, but it's in a number of states now, where guys are being, it happened in England as well. So you have very dangerous and deviant men that are being sent into women's prison, a female inmate. All she knows is her door opens, and now guess who her new cell is? So there's domestic violence and there's rape going on all the time with these guys. Rape shelters, as Tracy mentioned. You can't keep these guys out. If this thing passes, women's sports are done. What used to be single space protected situation like WeSpa, those are done. That deviant men will have access to women no matter where they are. There's nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Tracy, what else, in closing, as we're wrapping up, what else should people know about H.R. 15, the Equality Act? Here in the U.S., they had better contact their congressman, because this thing has pretty much a significant Democrat majority support.
Right, and some GOP support too. So my advice is always that the time to act to protect yourself and your family against this ideology is before it actually affects your family. And if this goes into law, it's going to affect your family. It's going to affect you personally. And so before this hits your door, you need to act. So act now, call your legislator, your House member in DC, and let them know that this is a harmful bill that's a threat to the rights of the majority of citizens, especially to women, and that you want them to vote no on this. And organize in your community to have a rally at your capital or other meeting place that's a good rally point, and invite media and talk to the media. We need the media to start hearing the voices of women. In fact, later in August, I'm having an event with other women in Austin, and it's called Let Women Speak, and we'll be addressing this issue. We're having speakers, prominent female activists from around the country coming to the Let Women Speak. Our event has our advertisements on Facebook and Instagram and on Eventbrite have been taken down because already without this kind of legislation, they don't want to let women speak. So women, if you want to be able to speak at all, fathers, if you want to protect your children, and husbands, if you want to protect your wives, you need to act now to protect. This event is Let Women Speak, but we need everyone. We need every voice to speak up to protect all of our rights, because everything you hold dear is at odds. It is under attack by this ideology that is at odds with everyone else's rights. This is no time to just be kind. We've been told to be quiet, be kind. No, it's time to speak up. So act now.
Brad, it's serious. This thing is going to continue. This is a juggernaut. Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and now it's targeting the U.S. Tracy, thank you for being on with us and alerting us to this danger. Brad, and thank you as always.
Thank you both. The definition of the word equality is not what our viewers think it is. There is a new definition that's been presented. It is being accepted, and it is deviant and inclusive in ways that you can't imagine. For more information, you can continue to watch Unmasking the Trans Movement. You can also find out more about us online at our website, UnMaskingTheTransMovement.com, or on Rumble, BitChute, YouTube. Find us. We have the information that's going to help you along. And if you're looking for information on the definition of equality, look it up. It has changed. Till next time, I'm Brad Wilder on behalf of John Euler and Tracy Shannon. Remember, it's not our kids' fight, it's our fight. We'll see you soon.